On a rainy October evening in 2004, a 48-year-old shop teacher in Ashwood, Ohio, sat down at his daughter's computer and saw a ghost. Daniel Whitfield was not looking for one. His daughter Emily had called him over to look at something on one of those new social networking websites, a page belonging to a small Baptist church 3,000 miles away in McMinnville, Oregon. The page showed photographs from the church's autumn craft bazaar, folding tables, paper price tags, jars of apple butter, and in the third photograph, a gray-haired woman standing behind a table stacked with handmade quilts. Daniel leaned toward the screen, and the air went out of the room. The quilts were stitched in an 8-point star pattern, not just any star. A broken star, with one point deliberately reversed, turned against the grain of all the others. Daniel had seen that pattern exactly one place in his entire life. His grandmother Alma had invented it in her farmhouse kitchen, and never wrote it down, never shared it, never sold it. She always reversed one point on purpose, and when anyone asked why, she gave the same answer: because only God makes things perfect. Grandma Alma had been dead since 1969. She had taught the pattern to exactly one person before she died, her granddaughter Maggie, and Maggie Whitfield had vanished from the streets of Ashwood on a gray Tuesday morning in April of 1973, 5 months into her marriage, 21 years old, leaving behind a basket of folded laundry and a silence that had lasted 31 years. No body was ever found. No suspect was ever charged. Her mother died still setting a chair for her. Her father died still watching the door. The town had long ago decided who killed her, and the man they blamed had gone to his own grave without a trial and without a confession. Everyone in Ashwood knew Maggie Turner was dead. Everyone except the man now staring at a computer screen with his heart slamming against his ribs, looking at a woman in Oregon whose face was older, whose hair was gray, but whose hands were resting on a quilt that only one living person on this earth could possibly have made. Daniel enlarged the photograph until the pixels blurred. He looked at the shape of her jaw, the way she tilted her head, the small crescent of a smile that did not quite finish, and he heard himself say, out loud, in his daughter's bedroom, the words he had not allowed himself to say in 3 decades. That's my sister. If you have ever lost someone without explanation, if you have ever lived in that terrible limbo between desperate hope and crushing grief, then you already know what happened inside Daniel Whitfield in that moment. 31 years of searching, 31 years of flyers and false leads and phone calls that came to nothing. 31 years of a wound that never closed because it was never allowed to. All of it collapsing into a single photograph on a church website, posted by a volunteer who had no idea what she had done. How does a newly married woman evaporate from a small Ohio town in broad daylight without a single trace? How does she stay hidden through 3 decades while her family tears itself apart looking for her? And why, when the truth finally came out, did it point back to the very last person anyone in Ashwood would ever have suspected? This is the story of Maggie Whitfield. A story about what people survive, what they sacrifice, and what it costs to come home. Before we continue with this shocking story, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any case. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We want to know where our community is. Now let's go back to where it all began. Ashwood, Ohio, in the spring of 1973, was the kind of town that fit inside a single breath. 4,000 people, 1 paper mill, 1 high school, 2 church steeples you could see from anywhere on Main Street. The kind of place where the hardware store owner knew your father's first name and your grandfather's debts. Where doors went unlocked and children walked to school alone, and nothing bad had ever happened that the town couldn't explain by supper time. The Whitfield family lived on the east side, in a white 2-story house with a porch swing Harold Whitfield had hung the summer his daughter was born. Harold worked for the railroad, 31 years of grease and gravel, and coming home tired. His wife Ruth kept the house, kept the church flower committee, kept everyone's secrets, and none of her own. They had 2 children. Daniel, 17 that spring, all elbows and engine grease, counting the days to graduation. And Margaret, Maggie, 21 years old, born on March 3, 1952, with her grandmother's steady hands and her mother's quiet way of watching a room. Maggie was the gentle one, the one who sewed her own dresses from patterns she drew freehand, the one Grandma Alma had chosen, out of all the grandchildren, to learn the broken star quilt. The 2 of them bent over the frame in the farmhouse kitchen for whole winters, the old woman's voice low, 1 point turned backward, always, because only God makes things perfect. In November of 1972, Maggie had married Raymond Turner in the Methodist church with the whole town watching. Raymond was 26, a foreman at the mill, broad-shouldered and quick to laugh, the kind of man who shook every hand at the reception twice. Harold thought him a little loud. Ruth thought him a little watchful. But Maggie smiled in her white dress, and parents learned to fold their doubts away. The newlyweds rented a small house on Linden Street, 6 blocks from the Whitfields, and Maggie settled into the life every young wife in Ashwood was expected to want. 5 months later, on the morning of Tuesday, April 17, 1973, the sky over Ashwood hung low and gray, and the radio promised rain by afternoon. It was cool for April, the kind of damp cold that gets into your sleeves. Maggie was up before 7. Neighbors on Linden Street later remembered the ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning: the screen door, the radio through the kitchen window. At around 20 minutes to 10, Maggie stepped out of the house carrying a wicker basket of laundry balanced on her hip. She wore a pale blue cotton dress she had sewn herself, a white cardigan against the chill brown loafers, and her thin gold wedding ring. Her light brown hair was pinned back the way she always wore it on washing days. Mrs. Kowalski next door waved from her garden, and Maggie waved back. Nothing in her face, the neighbor would tell the sheriff 100 times in the years that followed. Nothing in her face said goodbye. She walked the 4 blocks to Miller's Laundrette on Main Street the way she did every Tuesday. Same sidewalk, same storefronts, same bell over the same glass door. Edna Miller, who owned the place, remembered her coming in at about 5 minutes past 10, remembered small talk about the rain coming, remembered Maggie feeding dimes into the machine. To Edna, to Mrs. Kowalski, to every single person who saw her that morning, Maggie Turner was exactly what she appeared to be, a quiet young bride doing her washing. Only one person in Ashwood knew what was underneath the long sleeves of that white cardigan, and that person had already made a decision that would tear 2 families apart for 31 years, and save a life doing it. What happened next took less than 2 hours, and it would take 31 years to explain. At 5 minutes past 10, Maggie was inside Miller's Laundrette, feeding dimes into a washing machine. At 10:30, Edna Miller saw her sitting on the wooden bench by the window, hands folded in her lap, watching the rain start to spot the sidewalk. At 11 o'clock, Maggie moved her wet clothes to the dryer and began folding a first batch on the counter, corner to corner, neat as always. And at about 20 minutes past 11, Edna looked up from her register and saw Maggie push open the glass door and step out onto Main Street. Edna assumed she was running an errand while the dryer finished. The bell over the door rang once, and Maggie Turner walked out of her own life. No one saw where she went. No one heard a car door, a raised voice, a scream. No one saw a struggle, because there was no struggle. One moment she was a young wife on a gray sidewalk in a town of 4,000 people, and the next moment she had simply evaporated, gone between one heartbeat of that town and the next. No purse left behind, because she carried almost nothing. No note, no witness, no trace. The dryer finished its cycle at 10 minutes to 12 and sat there, warm and silent, holding her husband's work shirts. The basket of clothes she had already folded stayed on the bench by the window, stacked so carefully that Edna would later say it haunted her more than anything else. Nobody runs away, Edna told the sheriff, and folds the towels first. The afternoon passed. The rain came and went. At 6 o'clock, Raymond Turner came home from the mill to a dark house and a cold stove. He would tell police he assumed his wife was at her mother's. At 7:30, he telephoned the Whitfield house, and Ruth Whitfield's stomach dropped, because Maggie had not been there all day. Raymond drove the streets between Linden and Main. Harold and 17-year-old Daniel took the other side of town. They found the laundrette locked, and through the window, in the half-dark, they could see the wicker basket still sitting on the bench. At 10 minutes to 9 that night, Raymond Turner walked into the county sheriff's office and reported his wife missing. Sheriff Vernon Pike took the report himself. 21 years old, 5'4", pale blue dress, white cardigan, brown loafers, gold wedding band. Last seen at about 11:20 in the morning, on Main Street, in the middle of town, in the middle of the day. By dawn, on April 18th, Ashwood had come undone. Men from the mill walked the fields shoulder to shoulder. Boats dragged the slow brown length of the Ashwood River. Volunteers searched barns, culverts, the woods along the county road, calling her name into the wet spring air until their voices gave out. Dogs were brought in and given her nightgown to smell. They traced her steps from the laundrette door to the curb, a few feet up the sidewalk, and then stopped, circling, whining, lost, as if the trail rose off the face of the earth. For 3 days the town searched. For 3 weeks the county searched. They found nothing. Not a shoe, not a button, not a thread of pale blue cotton. Sheriff Pike stood on Main Street with his hat in his hands, and told a reporter from Columbus the sentence that would follow him to his grave. "It's like she walked around that corner," he said, "and stepped clean off the world." But Maggie had not stepped off the world. At the moment her husband was reporting her missing, she was sitting in the window seat of a westbound Greyhound bus, 400 miles away, shaking, one hand resting on her stomach, learning how to breathe. But in 1973, nobody was looking at a bus depot. They were looking at a husband. It is the oldest arithmetic in police work. When a wife disappears, you start at her own kitchen table. And the closer Sheriff Pike looked at Raymond Turner, the less he liked what he saw. There were the scratches for a start. 3 parallel marks on Raymond's left forearm, raw and recent, noticed by a deputy the very night he reported Maggie missing. Raymond said he'd caught his arm on a conveyor guard at the mill, and 2 men on his shift backed him up. But the town had already seen the scratches, and the town had already done its own arithmetic. Then there was the argument. The Sunday before Maggie vanished, neighbors on Linden Street heard raised voices from the Turner house. A man shouting, a door slamming hard enough to rattle a window. When Pike asked about it, Raymond shrugged and called it nothing. A disagreement about money, the kind every married couple has. Maggie's mother remembered it differently. Ruth told the sheriff her daughter had come to church that Sunday with her sleeves buttoned at the wrist on a warm morning, and had flinched, actually flinched, when Raymond reached past her for a hymnal, and there was the wrist. In February, 2 months before she disappeared, Maggie had turned up at the county clinic with a broken left wrist. "Fell on the ice," she said. Everyone fell on the ice in an Ohio February. The doctor said it, signed the form, and thought no more about it. Only later, much later, would that piece of paper be read the way it should have been read the first time. Pike questioned Raymond 4 times that spring and summer. Raymond took a polygraph and passed it. He let them search the house, the car, the shed. They took up floorboards. They dug in the garden while half the street watched from the sidewalk. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. But absence of evidence has never once stopped a small town from reaching a verdict. By August, Raymond Turner could not buy groceries in Ashwood without the aisle going quiet around him. Mothers pulled their children close when he passed. Someone painted a word on his fence in the night, and he painted over it, and they painted it again. The mill kept him on, but the men who had stood beside him at his wedding stopped meeting his eyes. Here is the terrible truth at the center of this story, and you need to hold on to it, because nothing that comes later makes sense without it. The town was wrong about what Raymond Turner did, and the town was right about what he was. Behind the door of that little rented house on Linden Street, Raymond had been hurting his wife for months. The watchfulness Ruth had sensed at the wedding was real. The broken wrist was not the ice. The buttoned sleeves were not modesty. Maggie Whitfield had spent the winter of 1973 learning to move quietly, to answer carefully, to read a man's shoulders from across a room. In 1973, there was no phrase for what was happening to her. There were no shelters, no hotlines, no laws worth the paper. A wife was her husband's business. If she had gone to Sheriff Pike, he would have driven her home. If she had gone to her parents, the pastor would have counseled patience and prayer. She was 21 years old, paralyzed by fear, and utterly alone, except she wasn't. Because one other person had learned to read Raymond's shoulders long before Maggie ever did. Someone who had buttoned her own sleeves at the wrist through 20 years of Sunday mornings. Someone the police never questioned, never suspected, never once considered. And in the second week of April, that person had quietly decided that Maggie Turner was going to live. In August of 1973, 4 months after Maggie vanished, an envelope arrived at the house on Linden Street. Plain paper, no letter, no return address, postmarked Chicago. Inside, wrapped in a single square of tissue, was Maggie's thin gold wedding ring. Raymond brought it to the sheriff's office with hands that would not hold still, and the investigation caught fire all over again. To Pike, the ring could mean only dark things. A kidnapper taunting the family. A killer shedding the last piece of evidence. Detectives went to Chicago and walked the neighborhood around the postmark for a week. Nothing. The ring sat in an evidence envelope for the next 3 decades. A cruel little circle of gold that seemed to prove Maggie had met something terrible. No one imagined the truth. That the ring had been mailed by a woman none of them would ever meet. A stranger in a relay of strangers. Because Maggie had asked for one thing only when she took the ring off her finger. She wanted it to go back. She was done carrying it. The following spring brought the second false dawn. A convict named Gerald Hobbs, serving time in Mansfield for burglary, told a cellmate he had killed a girl in Ashwood and put her in the river. Hobbs was the kind of man prisons know well, a serial confessor collecting attention the way other men collect cigarettes. But the family was not told that part at first. For 11 days, Ruth Whitfield did not sleep, waiting by the phone while detectives drove Hobbs up and down the county roads asking him to show them the spot. He could not name the street Maggie lived on. He could not say what she was wearing. He placed her body in a stretch of river that had been dragged bare. He recanted before summer, and the file went quiet again, and Ruth learned the particular cruelty of hope, which is that it does not knock before it enters, and it does not clean up when it leaves. Then came October of 1981. 2 duck hunters found human remains in the shallows of Coldwater Lake, 40 miles from Ashwood. A woman, the coroner said, young, in the ground, or in the water, roughly the right number of years. For 5 months, the Whitfield family lived inside a grief that had finally been given a shape. Ruth chose a dress to bury her daughter in. Harold priced headstones, standing in the monument yard with his hat in his hands. Daniel, 25 by then, drove his mother to the county building twice a week for news. And in March of 1982, the dental records came back. The teeth were wrong. The woman in the lake was not Maggie. She was somebody else's daughter, never identified. A stranger the Whitfields would quietly pay to bury, because no one else came for her. The family drove home from the coroner's office, in a silence that had no name. What do you call it when the worst news in the world turns out to be false, and the falseness is its own kind of loss? They could not grieve, because there was no body. They could not hope, because there was no sign. There was only the limbo, the open wound, the ambiguous loss that experts would one day call the hardest grief a human being can carry, precisely because it never ends. 3 times the world had offered the Whitfields an answer: a ring in the mail, a liar in a prison cell, a stranger in a lake. 3 times the answer had crumbled in their hands like wet paper. Fragments. Only ever fragments. And each time the true answer sat untouched 3 time zones away, folding diapers in a rented room in Oregon, going by a name that no one in Ohio had ever heard. The years that followed did not pass so much as accumulate, the way snow accumulates on a roof, silently, until something gives. Daniel Whitfield grew up inside his sister's absence. He graduated, married a girl named Susan from Marion, became the shop teacher at the same high school Maggie had walked through, and every single day he drove past Miller's Laundrette on his way to work, watched the missing posters fade in the window, watched Edna take them down when the sun bleached them white, watched his mother put fresh ones up, watched the phone, watched the door, watched his parents grow old around a hole in the middle of the family that nothing was ever allowed to fill. The Whitfields kept Maggie's childhood bedroom exactly as it was. Ruth dusted it every Saturday. Her sewing basket stayed by the window, threaded needles rusting in the pincushion. Every Christmas, Harold set a chair for her at the table, and every Christmas nobody spoke of it, and everybody saw it. That single Tuesday morning in April had split their lives in two, into everything before 11:20 and everything after. Harold Whitfield died of a heart attack in 1988. In the porch swing he had hung the summer his daughter was born. He was 66. He had spent 15 years writing letters to police departments in other states, and he died without one answer to show for it. Raymond Turner outlived his suspicion but never escaped it. He stayed in Ashwood, God knows why, growing gray and solitary in the little house on Linden Street, tried by no court except the town, which never once adjourned. In 1994, his car left the county road on a clear night and met an oak tree, and Ashwood buried its favorite suspect with more relief than mourning. Whatever Raymond knew or didn't know, whatever he had done or hadn't done behind that door, went into the ground with him. His mother, Dorothy, stood alone at the graveside. She died 3 years later, in 1997, a quiet widow whom the town remembered mostly for her casseroles, and she took a secret to her grave that would have knocked Ashwood off its foundations. And then it was just Ruth and Daniel. In the winter of 2001, Ruth Whitfield lay in a hospital bed in Columbus with her son's hand in hers. She was 78, and she had spent 28 years being the mother of the girl who vanished. In her last days, she said something Daniel would carry like a stone in his pocket for the rest of his life. "Keep looking," she told him. "She's not in the ground. I'd feel it. Mothers feel it," Daniel promised. He was 45 years old, and he did not believe a word of it, and he promised anyway, because that is what you do. They buried Ruth beside Harold in March of 2001, and on the headstone, beneath their 2 names, the family left a space. If you have ever made a promise to someone dying, a promise you were sure you could never keep, you know the weight Daniel carried out of that hospital room. He had no leads. He had no hope. He had a folder of yellowed clippings and a sister, who had been gone for 28 years. What he could not know, what none of us could ever have guessed, was that the promise was already keeping itself. Because 1,800 miles away, a widow in Oregon was about to do something she had not dared to do in 3 decades. She was about to let someone take her photograph. In the next part, we're going to discover something incredible: how a quilt, a college freshman, and a brand new thing called social media cracked a case that 31 years of police work could not. If you want to know what happened next, like this video and share it with someone who loves true stories. To understand that photograph, you have to go back to the bus. On the morning of April 17, 1973, Maggie Turner walked out of Miller's Laundrette with nothing but her cardigan and $11 of her own. 2 blocks away, on a side street, a car was waiting, exactly as she had been told it would be. She got in. The car drove her 20 minutes to the Greyhound Depot in Marion, where a ticket had already been bought in a name that was not hers. The person behind the wheel said almost nothing on that drive. Only, at the end, pressing a folded envelope of bills into Maggie's hands, one sentence: "Don't write, don't call. Not your mother, not anybody. That's how they find you." Then Maggie was on the 1215 going west, and the only life she had ever known was sliding backward past the window. She cried through Indiana. She stopped crying in Iowa. Somewhere in the long yellow emptiness of Nebraska, she put her hand on her stomach, on the child Raymond did not know about, and made the same promise her brother would one day make to their dying mother. Keep going. In McMinnville, Oregon, a town of walnut orchards and church bells that looked heartbreakingly like the place she had fled, a woman named Ida was waiting at the depot. Ida asked no questions. Ida had done this before. Within 6 weeks, Maggie Whitfield had a rented room, a job hemming garments at a dry cleaner, and a new name pieced together from a schoolteacher she had loved and a street sign she had passed: Eleanor Gray. The paper trail of Eleanor Gray begins in June of 1973. Before that, she does not exist. On December 9, 1973, in a hospital in Salem, Eleanor Gray gave birth to a son and named him Paul. The nurses noticed she had no visitors, no husband, no mother, pacing the hallway, and they noticed the way she held that baby, like something rescued from a fire. Understand what she believed, because it is the hinge this whole story turns on. Maggie believed she could never go back and never call, not because she did not love her family, but because she did. In 1973, a runaway wife was a scandal, not a survivor. She was certain her parents would be ashamed, certain the law would side with her husband, certain that one phone call traced, one letter postmarked, would put Raymond on a westbound road with his fists. So she followed the rule, and the rule became a habit, and the habit became a life, and the life quietly hardened around her like wax. In 1979, she married Samuel Pruitt, a widowed carpenter with gentle hands, who never once raised his voice in 24 years, and who never knew his wife's real name. They had 2 children, James, and a daughter, Eleanor, insisted on calling Ruth Ann, after a grandmother the little girl was told had died long ago. Eleanor Pruitt drove carpool, taught Sunday school, grew roses, and sewed. Lord, how she sewed. But every April 17th, without one exception in 30 years, Samuel would find his wife sitting alone in the dark of the sewing room, and he learned never to ask. She thought about calling home 10,000 times. When Paul took his first steps, when Man Walked on the Moon reruns played, and she remembered her father. Every Christmas, dialing all but the last number, but too much time had passed, and then too much more. How do you call your mother after 5 years of silence? After 15? After 25? The silence itself became the crime she could not confess. Samuel died in the spring of 2003, and a widow with a house full of quilts let her church talk her into selling a few at the autumn bazaar. Somebody brought a camera that day. The photograph was taken by a church volunteer named Peggy, 61 years old, using her first digital camera, at the First Baptist Autumn Bazaar in McMinnville on the 2nd of October 2004. Peggy took 41 pictures that afternoon. She posted them a few days later to the church's page on one of the new social networking sites, so that shut-ins and grandchildren who had moved away could see the tables. She thought nothing of it. Nobody thinks anything of the pebble that starts the landslide. 2,000 miles east, in Ashwood, Emily Whitfield had come home from college for a long weekend. Emily was 19, the same age her aunt had been as a newlywed, and she had grown up inside the family mystery, the way some kids grow up inside a family business. That fall, She had talked her father into letting her post Maggie's story on the missing persons message boards that were spreading across the young internet, along with an age-progressed sketch. Nothing had come of it, but Emily had also inherited something else. The last quilt Grandma Alma ever finished hung on the wall of the Whitfield living room, and Emily had loved it her whole life. So on the night of October 9th, 2004, killing time online, she typed the words "Broken Star Quilt" into the search box of a networking site and began scrolling through strangers' photographs, sewing circles in Georgia, a museum page in Pennsylvania, and then a church bazaar in Oregon. Emily stopped scrolling. She looked at the quilt on the folding table, and then she looked up at the quilt on the wall, and then she called for her father in a voice that brought him up the stairs 2 at a time. You already know what Daniel saw, but you need to know what he did next, because this is where 31 years of discipline mattered. Daniel had been burned before, burned by Hobbs, burned by the lake. He had watched false hope take years off his mother's life, and he refused to let it take his. So he did not shout, and he did not book a flight. He sat down, and he studied. He took Alma's quilt off the wall and laid it on the floor, and Emily printed the photograph, and father and daughter knelt over them both with a magnifying glass from his toolbox. The 8 points, the pieced border, and there, in the quilt on that Oregon table, in the lower left, 1 point reversed, turned against the grain of all the others. Deliberate, unmistakable, Alma's flaw, because only God makes things perfect. Then he made himself look at the woman, and the longer he looked, the less air there was in the room. The jaw was his mother's jaw. The hands were folded left over right, and Daniel heard his father's voice across 40 years, teasing at the supper table. Maggie girl, you fold your hands like you're hiding cards. Emily found 3 more pictures in Peggy's album. In one of them, the gray-haired woman was laughing at something out of frame. Her chin dipped, her eyes closed. Daniel had a photograph on his mantle, taken at Christmas 1972, of his sister laughing exactly like that. He sat back on the floor of his living room, 50 years old that coming winter, and he began to shake. Not weeping, shaking, the way a bridge shakes when the load finally shifts. 31 years, 10,000 nights of not knowing. His father dead without an answer, his mother dead on a promise, and now, a stranger's snapshot, posted so that shut-ins could see the craft tables, was telling him that his mother had been right all along. She's not in the ground. I'd feel it. The caption under the photograph said the quilts were sewn by a beloved member of the congregation. It gave a name, Eleanor Pruitt. Daniel did not sleep that night, and in the morning he did the hardest thing a desperate man can do. He moved slowly. He knew that if he was wrong, he would be tearing open a stranger's life. And he knew that if he was right, he would be tearing open his sister's. So instead of the telephone, he went to a man named Carl Jensen, a retired detective out of Columbus, who worked missing persons cases in his own quiet way, and who had heard every wild theory a grieving family can produce. Jensen listened to Daniel for an hour, looked at the 2 quilts side by side, and did not laugh. That's not a resemblance, Jensen finally said, tapping the reversed point. That's a signature. Jensen flew to Oregon the following week. What he found made the hair stand up on his arms. Eleanor Pruitt was a pillar of McMinnville, 31 years in town, widow of a well-liked carpenter, 3 grown children, but before her marriage she had been Eleanor Gray, and Eleanor Gray was a woman made of smoke. No birth certificate that matched, no school records, no family, no history of any kind before June of 1973, when she surfaced in McMinnville, a young woman alone and visibly pregnant. 8 weeks after Maggie Turner walked out of a laundrette in Ohio. Jensen had seen manufactured identities before. Criminals build them sloppy, witnesses build them scared. This one, he told Daniel on the phone, was built by somebody who was never supposed to be found, and my whole gut says she built it to stay alive. Now came the question that should stop all of us cold. How do you knock on that door? For anyone who has ever had to deliver news that would demolish a life in order to heal another one, you know there is no good way, only less cruel ones. If Eleanor Pruitt was Maggie, then Maggie had spent 31 years hiding from something, and a stranger on the porch saying your real name is a form of violence all its own. So Jensen went to the one man in McMinnville built for it. Pastor Michael Combs had buried Samuel Pruitt and had known Eleanor for 20 years. Jensen sat in his office, laid out the photographs, the timeline, the quilt, and watched the color leave the pastor's face. Combs was quiet a long time. Then he said, I always knew that woman was carrying something. I figured it was hers to carry. On a cold gray afternoon in the middle of November, 2004, Pastor Combs sat in Eleanor Pruitt's kitchen, took her hand, and said, as gently as such a thing can be said, that a family in Ohio had been looking for a woman for 31 years, and that there were people who believed she was that woman. Eleanor did not cry out. She did not deny it. Those who love her say she simply set down her coffee cup with both hands and looked out the window at her roses for a long, long moment, and then asked a single question, in a voice the pastor had never heard her use. Is my mother alive? And Pastor Combs, who had the answer, had to give it to her. Maggie Whitfield learned in the same minute that she had been found, and that she had been found too late. Too late for the mother who swore she would feel it. Too late for the father and the porch swing. 31 years of silence, kept first out of terror, then out of shame, then out of habit, and the bill for all of it arrived in one sentence in her own kitchen. She was 52 years old. She put her head down on the table where her children had eaten 1,000 suppers, and she wept for people who had been dead for years. Belief is not proof, and everyone in this story had been burned by belief before. Maggie needed proof for her own children, who, as far as they knew, had just learned their mother might be a missing woman from Ohio. Daniel needed proof, because he had buried false hope twice, and did not have a third funeral in him. So in the last week of November 2004, two strangers who might be brother and sister, each sat in a clinic chair 2,000 miles apart and let a technician run a cotton swab along the inside of a cheek. The samples went to a laboratory in Virginia for a sibling DNA comparison. The wait was quoted at 10 business days. Ask anyone who has lived it, and they will tell you those days have more hours in them than other days do. In Ashwood, Daniel taught his shop classes and ruined 2 perfectly good cabinet joints and jumped every single time the phone rang. In McMinnville, Maggie sat her 3 children down at the kitchen table and began, haltingly, to answer questions. Paul, 30 years old, learning in his mother's kitchen that the man on his birth certificate was invented. Ruth Ann, learning she had been named for a grandmother who was real, and loved, and lost. James just listening, watching his mother turn into someone he had never met. On the morning of December 2, 2004, Carl Jensen's phone rang, and a lab supervisor read him the numbers. 99.9% probability of full siblingship. Eleanor Pruitt of McMinnville, Oregon, was Margaret Ellen Whitfield of Ashwood, Ohio. 31 years, 7 months, and 15 days after she walked out of Miller's Laundrette, Maggie was officially alive. Jensen called Daniel at the high school, and they pulled him out of third period, and a room full of 16-year-olds watched their shop teacher take a phone call in the doorway, put one hand against the doorframe, and slide slowly down to a crouch. That evening, arranged by Jensen and Pastor Combs, with both parties' consent and a counselor on standby, a telephone rang in a farmhouse kitchen in Oregon. Maggie stood looking at it for 4 rings, one hand flat against her chest. Her daughter finally picked it up, said hello, listened, and held it out. "It's him," Ruth Ann whispered. "It's your brother." Nobody knows exactly what was said in that first minute because neither of them can remember it. Grief does that. Joy does it too. What Daniel remembers is that the voice was older, lower, sanded down by 3 decades and another life. And then his sister laughed, nervous, terrified, and the laugh had not aged 1 single day. It was the laugh from the Christmas photo on the mantel. What Maggie remembers is her little brother, the boy of elbows and engine grease, saying, "It's okay, it's okay, it's okay," over and over, a middle-aged man repeating it like a rope he was throwing across 31 years. They talked for 3 hours. He told her about Emily, about the message boards, about a quilt with one point turned backward, and Maggie had to set the phone down for a while, when she understood that it was Grandma Alma's flaw, that deliberate imperfection stitched in a farmhouse kitchen before 1969, that had reached across the whole country and pulled her home. She told him about Paul. Daniel learned, at 48, that he had a nephew 7 months younger than his sister's disappearance, and did that arithmetic in silence, and began to understand the shape of what had really happened in April of 1973. And at the very end of the call, Maggie asked the question she had been circling for 3 hours. "Danny, do they all think I let Mom die not knowing?" And Daniel gave the only true answer. "Come home," he said. "Come home and we'll carry it together." They met on January 15, 2005, in a private room of a hotel near the Portland airport because neutral ground felt safer than either of their kitchens. Daniel flew out with Emily and his wife Susan. Maggie came with all 3 of her children. A counselor waited in the corner, and nobody needed her, and everybody did. Daniel would say later that the door opened and his mother walked in. That was the first blow. the one nobody warns you about. Maggie at 52 was Ruth Whitfield's living echo, the same silver in the hair, the same way of pausing at a threshold. Brother and sister stood 6 feet apart for a moment that witnesses measure differently. Some say seconds, some say a full minute. Two gray-haired strangers wearing familiar faces. Then Maggie said, "You got tall, Danny," and the 6 feet disappeared. They held on to each other the way people hold on to wreckage. But this is not a fairy tale, and it would be a lie to pretend the room held nothing but joy. Joy was there, enormous and real. So was anger, arriving late, the way it does. So was 31 years of a family's grief standing in the corner demanding to be acknowledged. At some point that afternoon, Daniel asked the question he had flown across the country carrying. Why? Not why did you leave? By then he knew about Raymond, and one look at his nephew Paul, who had Raymond Turner's jaw and Maggie's eyes, confirmed the rest. The question was, why the silence? Mom sat by that phone for 28 years, Daniel said, and I need to understand. And so, in a hotel room with her children around her, Maggie finally told the whole of it. The winter of fists and buttoned sleeves, the wrist that was never the ice, the certainty, absolute in 1973, that no sheriff, no pastor, and no court would take her side, and the fear, absolute until the day Raymond died, that any letter home would lead him straight to her and to Paul. Then she told them the part no one had ever guessed, the secret under the secret, and the room went completely still. It was his mother, Maggie said. It was Dorothy. Dorothy Turner, Raymond's own mother, had seen the buttoned sleeves at church and known them for what they were, because she had buttoned her own sleeves through 20 years of marriage to Raymond's father. It was Dorothy who came to the house that April while Raymond worked. Dorothy who pressed $200 and a Greyhound ticket into Maggie's hands. Dorothy whose cousin Ida waited at a bus depot in Oregon. Dorothy who whispered, "Don't write, don't call, that's how they find you." And it was Dorothy who then stood silent for 24 years, at her son's kitchen table, at his graveside, while her own boy lived and died under suspicion of murder, because the only way to keep Maggie safe was to keep the mystery alive. She chose a stranger's daughter over her own flesh and blood, and she carried that unimaginable weight to her grave in 1997, without telling one living soul. Daniel sat back, shattered, rearranging 31 years of hatred and certainty. The whole town had spent 3 decades convicting Raymond Turner of a murder that never happened, and had spent the same 3 decades bringing casseroles to the quiet widow who had actually done it, who had made a woman vanish so completely that the earth seemed to have swallowed her, and whose crime was mercy. If you have ever discovered that the truth you built your grief on was wrong, you know the vertigo in that hotel room. Nobody spoke for a long time. Then Paul, 31 years old, crossed the room to the uncle he had never had, and put out his hand, and Daniel ignored the hand entirely and embraced him. In the spring of 2005, Maggie Whitfield went home. She had not seen Ashwood in 32 years, and Ashwood had never stopped seeing her. Her senior portrait in the paper every April, her name on the lips of every generation of children who dared each other past the old Turner house. Daniel drove her in from the Columbus airport, and she watched the fields go by with her hand pressed flat against the car window. Same water tower, same steeples, same laundrette building, a video store now, the bench long gone. They went to the cemetery on a Tuesday morning, because some part of her needed it to be a Tuesday. Harold and Ruth Whitfield share a headstone under a maple tree, and beneath their names, the family had left a space. Maggie stood in front of that space for a long time. Then she knelt down in the wet spring grass in her good coat, and she talked to her mother. Daniel walked back to the car and let her be. Whatever was said there belongs to them. But when she came back to the car, Daniel says, his sister looked like a woman who had finally set down something she had carried for so long she had forgotten it could be set down. There was one more grave. On the far side of the same cemetery, near the fence, Dorothy Turner lies next to the son the town never forgave. Maggie brought no flowers to Harold and Ruth that day that she did not also bring to Dorothy. She stood at the grave of her mother-in-law, her rescuer, her impossible silent savior, and she said thank you out loud to a woman who had never once, in 24 years, allowed herself to hear it. The years since have been what the counselors call integration and what the family calls Sundays. Maggie kept the name Eleanor because Eleanor is who her children know, but she took back her story. There were hard conversations that took years, and empty chairs that can never be filled. And every April 17th she still goes quiet. Some wounds close. They do not disappear. But Paul, Ruth Ann, and James have cousins now, and grandparents in photographs, and a great-grandmother's quilt pattern that Ruth Ann is learning stitch by stitch. One point always turned backward, because only God makes things perfect. Emily, the 19-year-old who typed a quilt pattern into a search box, is the reason any of it exists. And Daniel kept his promise. She wasn't in the ground. Her mother had felt it after all. In 2006, Maggie stood up in front of a church conference in Portland and told her story publicly for the first time. For the women in the room wearing long sleeves, she said this: "I was not taken. I was not killed. I was saved. By an old woman nobody would ever have suspected of anything but kindness. And I stayed silent because the world I ran from gave women like me no other door. If you are looking at a door like that right now, it is not 1973 anymore. There are people who will help you. You do not have to disappear to survive. Not every missing person is a tragedy waiting in a lake. Some of them are out there, alive, carrying a silence they don't know how to break, waiting for a photograph, a phone call, a brother who never stops looking. Hope is not foolish. Hope is endurance wearing its Sunday clothes. Share this video, not for morbidity, but to create awareness about the thousands of missing people whose families are still waiting, and about the survivors hiding in plain sight who need to know they can come home. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if this story moved you, subscribe for more true stories of families who never stop searching. Because sometimes the folded laundry is not an ending, because mothers feel it, and because sometimes miracles do happen.